They said it couldn't be done. Doubters chided Henry Ford for declaring that his Willow Run bomber plant could turn out a B-24 Liberator heavy bomber every hour. They'd called him crazy in 1896 too, but Ford ignored the naysayers, pushing past obstacles and failures until his gasoline-powered horseless carriage rolled down the streets of Detroit. His creation, which he christened a quadricycle, featured an engine with the equivalent pulling power of 4 horses. It was the machine that would transform a world and help win a war. With the war to end all wars in America's rearview mirror, the country was focused on the positive. Having lost any appetite it had for war, most of America was confident there would never be a future need for war machines, or the military. After World War I, Congress decreased the military's overall numbers. It also passed laws denying tax breaks to companies that owned equipment that could make weapons of war. Bethlehem Steel, the largest arms producer in the world, destroyed all their arms-making capability in 90 days to avoid the taxes. Randy Houghton, a pilot and former director of the Yankee Air Museum in Ypsilanti, Michigan, said during a presentation in June 2015. DuPont Corporation, which had been contracted to build 7 gunpowder factories for World War I, had spent $25 million of its own money. The government, when the war was over, cancelled the contract and basically said, because there's no more war, we don't need your powder. Meanwhile, the powers on the losing side of World War I were rearming, and without admitting it out loud, the United States was worried it might get dragged into another war. Just in case that happened, in November 1929, then Major Dwight D. Eisenhower was called upon to create a plan to make sure the country could mobilize its military if it needed to. But there was just one problem. The Great Depression was in full swing, and Congress wouldn't fund the plan. 4 years later, the situation in Europe started heating up. Adolf Hitler rose to power and brought Nazi law to Germany. By 1938, Germany had annexed Austria and the Sudetenland, the German-speaking part of Czechoslovakia along the German border. Through all of this, the United States maintained its isolationist ideals until November 9th, 1938, Kristallnacht. On what is referred to as the Night of Broken Glass, the Nazis terrorized German Jews, breaking windows of homes, businesses, and burning synagogues. Soon after, President Franklin D. Roosevelt asked Congress for 10,000 airplanes. 7 months later, while still claiming America wasn't interested in getting involved in Europe's war, Congress granted a compromise: 5,500 planes over 5 years, according to Houghton. By May 1940, Germany had invaded Poland, Belgium, France, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. This is the Blitzkrieg, Houghton said. This is the mechanized infantry with air power. Air power is now decisive. If you do not control the air over the battlefield, you will not win the battle. With the 12th largest army in the world, behind Brazil, America's military was not the powerhouse it is today. We had 32 tanks in the US inventory, Houghton said, comparing that figure to the nearly 6,000 tanks, German and Allied, that were involved in the May 1940 Battle of France. We had the 18th largest air force in the world, 326 modern airplanes that were obsolete by world standards. We had 54 heavy bombers. It was becoming much clearer that the US needed to ramp up production and fast. While foreign demand for war equipment, especially airplanes, skyrocketed and helped prop up America's fragile, depression-ravaged economy, Roosevelt remembered the problems encountered in World War I, when it had taken America too long to mobilize its forces. He went back to Congress and asked for a whopping 50,000 planes a year. When Hermann Goering, head of the German Luftwaffe, heard this, he laughed, Houghton said. He said, "No one can build 50,000 planes a year. That's pure propaganda." The US would have the last laugh. In 1944, the US would build nearly 100,000 airplanes. Roosevelt didn't have faith in the government to get America to a place where it could mobilize effectively, so he turned to the automotive industry, with its efficiencies and deep understanding of mechanization. Bill Knudsen, the then president of General Motors, was a Danish immigrant who had worked his way up the auto industry ladder. He knew everybody, and he knew how factories worked, according to Houghton. But Knudsen faced multiple problems, including the fact that nobody really knew what they wanted. The army was still ordering horse saddles for the cavalry at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. But the auto executive also knew something even more daunting. The mechanisms to mobilize America, the tools to make weapons of war, had been destroyed. He knew too it would take 18 months to get them back in place, and another 18 months to produce at peak levels. He said, "Aircraft and aircraft engines are the biggest problem we're going to face, and only the auto companies have the capability of building these airplanes and engines," Houghton noted. While that was true, it wasn't that simple. Knudsen faced a political hurdle. The army and the airplane companies didn't want the automakers involved in building airplanes. But then, the Battle of Britain, Germany's sustained bombing raids on the island, and Britain's desperate efforts to oppose them, opened eyes to the serious, terrifying threat of the German Air Force. "Bombers are now the offensive weapon," Houghton said. "The US identifies the four-engine bomber as what we need to fight the war. The distances in the Pacific to fight the Japanese are long. We need the long range of the bombers. We need airplanes that can carry tremendous loads, tremendous distances." After the Battle of Britain ended in the autumn of 1940, the United Kingdom asked for more bombers. Roosevelt turned to Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall and asked him to fulfill the request. Marshall's answer was a serious wake-up call. He only had 32 bombers left in the US, and if he gave them up, he wouldn't be able to train his crews. Bomber production, suddenly, became a top priority. In October 1940, Knudsen, who had resigned his position with GM to become the government's chairman of the Office of Production Management earlier that year, rounded up the heads of Studebaker, Nash Motors, GM, and Hudson Motor Car Company in New York, and boiled down the dire situation. America needed bombers, more than it could hope for, and sooner than it dared to ask for them. The auto industry leaders were in Detroit 2 weeks later, matching items they were already making for cars with similar items needed to make airplanes. The automakers said they could make all the pieces required to build the much-needed bombers. Factories to assemble the planes were also under construction. Tulsa, Oklahoma, would build B-24s, Kansas City, Kansas, B-25s, and Omaha, Nebraska, got the B-26. But in December 1940, the focus shifted to the B-24s. The B-24 is the most problematic airplane that the Army has on its list, Houghton said. It's faster, carries more, goes further than the B-17, and they want the B-24. Consolidated Aircraft had a contract to build the planes, but it had only completed 7 and delivered just 3. The Army decided the way to build the B-24 was through a collective effort, and World War I pilot, aviation pioneer, and racer Jimmy Doolittle would facilitate that effort. Then came December 7th, 1941. Japan attacked American military facilities in Hawaii and across the Pacific, and the US was now thrust into a new world war. Although too old to volunteer for World War II, Doolittle was called by Congress back to active duty for his expertise. Doolittle, who would gain fame for his daring air raid on Tokyo on April 18, 1942, held the first PhD in aeronautical engineering ever issued in the United States. The military assigned him to Detroit to enable what Houghton called a shotgun marriage between the auto companies and the aircraft companies. To make that happen, Doolittle turned to Henry Ford and his legendary precision assembly line to build parts. Ford agreed, until Charlie Sorensen, his right hand at Ford Motor Company, visited Consolidated San Diego operation in January 1941. What he saw stunned him. They were building aluminum airplanes outdoors on steel fixtures, Houghton said. They've got a surveyor's transit on pallets in the back of a pickup truck, with a guy looking at the centre line of the prop shaft to line it up. It took 4 hours to hang an engine. Reuben Fleet was the head of Consolidated, and the company was proud of its product. So when Sorensen expressed his dismay, Fleet took offence and asked him how he would do it better. Sorensen loved a challenge, Houghton said, and he replied, "You know what? I don't know, but I'll have an answer for you in the morning." With 35 years of manufacturing experience behind him, Sorensen spent that night breaking the B-24 down into assemblies, sub-assemblies, and parts for sub-assemblies, all carefully diagrammed in pencil on hotel stationery. The next morning he showed Fleet his plan, and was told flatly that it couldn't be done. Fleet asked if Ford would build parts for Consolidated, and was met with Sorensen's definitive answer. Ford wasn't interested in building sub-assemblies. It would build complete airplanes, or nothing. The Army Air Force had been looking for somebody who could answer their bomber production problem, Houghton said, and Ford stepped up and gave them the answer they wanted to hear. Based on Sorensen's pencil sketches, the Army, desperate for B-24s, awarded Ford a multi-million-dollar contract to build both the bomber plant and the airplanes. The contracts were signed in February, and the logistical debates began almost immediately. By April 1941, construction was already underway on 4 flat acres of Michigan farmland outside the small village of Ypsilanti, 25 miles west of Detroit. By May, the project was scaled up, based on government assurances that Ford would be building complete B-24s. Initially, it had been thought that the Willow Run plant would handle only final assembly of the B-24s, from parts manufactured at Ford's Rouge complex in Dearborn, 28 miles away. But Marshall kiboshed that idea, pointing out the potential for damage to the parts during transit. The decision that Willow Run would build complete bombers, from parts to planes, called for a bigger plant. Had it simply been tacked on to the end of the existing design, it would have landed right in the middle of the planned airport. As Houghton explained, so the guy in charge of the factory design said, "We've got to make a 90-degree turn, and since we're making a 90-degree turn, we might as well keep the factory inside Washtenaw County, Ypsilanti," noting that keeping the factory in one county would also provide a post-war tax benefit. By November 1941, all the airplane factories had been built, with Willow Run's final square footage reaching 4,734,617, and the airplanes America would fight World War II with were already in production, according to Houghton. FDR had given the US an 18-month head start on World War II, he said. Time magazine said this in February of 42. The miracle of American productivity was something Hitler didn't understand. He fully understood it. He was deathly afraid of it. But, based on German experience, he thought it would take the US 4 years to mobilize, and he would have won by that time. If Hitler had walked through Willow Run in 1942, his assessment might have appeared accurate. Ford was indeed building the B-24s at Willow Run, but Consolidated was still in charge, and it had no blueprints for Ford to work from, just sketches, drawings, and rough templates. The materials were nothing Ford could use in his efficient, precision-based assembly line. So, he put 200 engineers on rotating shifts around the clock 7 days a week. They produced 5 miles of drawings a day based on Consolidated's materials, but by the time they got them back to Detroit from San Diego, 10,000 of the 30,000 drawings were already obsolete. "All the tooling they designed now doesn't work," Houghton said, "because Consolidated changed the airplane every day." The result? A 6-month delay in Ford's production schedule, because they'd planned their equipment and workflow around a moving target. Meanwhile, the media was watching closely. The Detroit Free Press ran a headline boasting that Willow Run would be building a bomber a minute by summer. And of course, it was written in the paper, so it must be true, Houghton said with a laugh. Not only was a bomber a minute a fantasy, but Willow Run was supposed to deliver its first model in May 1942. It didn't fly until September. The press began mocking the project, calling it "Will It Run?" The delays, however, as the Truman Committee would later discover, were not Ford's fault. Headed by then-Senator Harry S. Truman, the committee had been charged with rooting out graft and corruption in the defense industry. He's sent to look at Willow Run, Houghton explained. The government is even considering nationalizing Ford Motor Company to take over Willow Run. But what Truman found told a different story. The delays were a direct result of Consolidated being allowed to call Willow Run and make changes, whenever they wanted, and they did, every single day. Truman's committee gave Willow Run a clean bill of health, concluding that all the meddling from Consolidated was keeping things from moving forward, Houghton said. The committee called for a single plant manager, someone with the authority to make real decisions affecting the day-to-day operations of the factory. From that point on, the plant manager made the calls, and production began to surge. Meanwhile, able-bodied men were being drafted or volunteering for military service, and Ford began hiring women. By May 1942, 15% of the Willow Run workforce was women, and they were earning the same wages as men for the same jobs. 13 months later, employment peaked at 42,000, and by the summer of 1944, the factory was humming along. Production had reached a bomber an hour, just as Henry Ford had promised, and employment had been reduced to 17,000, thanks to the incredible efficiencies the auto industry had brought to the making of the B-24. The centre wing assembly was the key to meeting that bomber-an-hour quota, Houghton said. All the prefabricated structures had already been pre-manufactured. They didn't have to be fit. They would just snap into place. Workers placed the parts into the wing, riveters knocked the wing components together, and then the centre wing assembly was sent to a multifunction machine that performed 42 precision machining operations to within 0.0002 of an inch in just 17 minutes. 6.5 man-hours were invested in those centre wings, Houghton said. Consolidated had about 1,500 hours involved in their centre wing. From there, all of the remaining pieces, all pre-made and waiting, were fitted to the section as it moved down the assembly line. Plumbing, wiring, landing gear, cockpit shields, instrumentation, all added quickly and efficiently. The wings, however, could have been a serious challenge. Henry Ford hired 8 dwarfs, Houghton said. And if you read the stories, they were very proud of what they were doing. For the first time in their lives, they weren't sideshows. They had a real job. They'd climb inside the wing and hold the backing plates that attached the outer wing to the centre wing. Despite how smoothly the plant ran, putting out a bomber an hour was still no easy feat. Willow Run operated 2 9-hour shifts. The remaining 4 hours were used to restock parts and change tooling. That was the schedule, 6 days a week. By the end of the war, Ford had pushed 8,865 B-24 heavy bombers out the Willow Run doors for the Army Air Force. The plant went from building just 1 plane a month in October 1942 to nearly 500 a month by June 1944, with the capacity to produce 6 150 B-24s a month by fall. The Army, however, slowed production to 200 bombers a month. The Army literally said, "Slow down, we have no place to park them. The losses in combat haven't been what we expected," Houghton said. By the time the last B-24 rolled off the Willow Run assembly line on June 28, 1945, the plant had produced more than £92 million of airplanes. In 1944 alone, Willow Run produced nearly as many aircraft as the entire nation of Japan, according to the Ann Arbor Observer. Given the limited capacity of the aircraft industry and the enormous pressure for airplanes, it was fair to conclude the Army Air Force was justified in underwriting this Ford experiment, Houghton said. Years later, Willow Run's legacy faced a new kind of battle. A General Motors holding when GM declared Chapter 11 bankruptcy in 2009, the massive factory was destined for demolition until a small Michigan organization known as the Yankee Air Museum stepped in. Backed by the Michigan Aerospace Foundation, the museum worked tirelessly, over 4 years, to save a portion of the historic bomber plant. Once a sprawling military defense colossus, only 144,000 square feet were spared the wrecking ball. Once restored, it will house the Yankee Air Museum, which will be renamed the National Museum of Aviation and Technology at historic Willow Run. At a dark time in American history, Houghton said, the US turned to Detroit to save the world, literally. While we might not think of Willow Run as a large battleground, 100 years from now, people will come here to hear this story, and that's what we have to preserve at Willow Run.